Hi there, CES students. Dr. Brazier here. Let's take a look at what is going on in session 6, focused around gatekeeping and mentorship. So you have a video lecture by me on those two particular topics. Here are your topic outcomes. The assigned reading for this week, you're reading 2 chapters in your textbook. Chapter 9, the role of gatekeeping in counselor ed, and Chapter 11, the role of mentoring in counselor ed. And then you need to peruse the ethical guidelines for counseling supervisors, which was by ACES way back in '95 through the lens of gatekeeping. So you're reading that, but with an eye for the practice of gatekeeping. Here is a lecture on what we do at CCU for gatekeeping, and you're going to need to have watched specifically this lecture because you have an assignment attached to this, a collaborative sort of discussion type assignment connected to this particular video here. So please make sure that you're viewing it actively, taking notes and that kind of thing, pausing things. You can always take screenshots if you need to. Here's another one on mentorship, how we do mentorship at CCU. Both of these are intended to show you sort of the good, the bad, the ugly, like what we do. And then also I want you, especially on this one, but really with both of them, it'll be easier with the mentoring one, I think, but bring your critical thinking hat to these videos. So don't just swallow them like, yes, this is what we do, but be thinking as I'm talking through what are we doing well at CCU currently as it currently stands, and what could be improved. What are we not doing well? So you're not just like absorbing the information, rather you're thinking critically about the information, the pros and the cons of what we do here. Your FICIT for this week is based on 1 Peter 5, 1 through 7, and I'll read it for you. So to the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. And then here is Dr. Vincent Tompkins, talking about teaching God's students. I think Dr. Tompkins is fantastic, and I'm excited for you to view his FICIT video. And here are the references. So what are you turning in for this week? Obviously, you're going to self-report on the percentage of viewing and reading that you've done based on what was assigned, remembering that skimming is allowed, and bringing a critical lens to what do I need to really take time and focus in on in the viewing and reading, and then what can I sort of move through quickly. So there's that self-report tool. What are you doing in your teaching philosophies for this week? Well, let's take a look here. So you are writing 2 chapters, one on gatekeeping and one on mentorship, your philosophy on these 2 crucial activities in counselor ed. So to prompt you and prep you for writing that paragraph on gatekeeping in counselor ed, I've given you some questions here to consider. So what are the ethical principles that should be considered regarding gatekeeping? Ethical principles being things like autonomy, justice, fidelity, things of that nature. What are the ACA ethical codes involving gatekeeping practices? And I want you thinking about specific codes from the ACA Code of Ethics to cite. And how do these codes influence your view of gatekeeping in counselor ed? What are the CACRIP 2024 standards that relate to gatekeeping? Again, paying attention to specific codes. How does cultural competence fit with the counselor educator's responsibility of gatekeeping? Please consider citing specific MSJCC in codes in that section. And then what are some biblical principles that might impact how you carry out your role as gatekeeper within counselor ed? I would encourage you to look back at the verses that Dr. Tompkins addressed in his FICIT video. There are some biblical principles embedded within that can totally get you started to answer that particular question. include an exploration of gatekeeping through the lens of biblical anthropology, hamartiology, soteriology, and sanctification, and even ecclesiology. So, in other words, the study of the church. Provide specific scripture references for your assertions in that section. And then the second paragraph is on your philosophy of mentorship in counselor education. So here are some questions to guide you. Very similar. Ethical principles regarding mentoring, ACA ethical codes, specific one-sided regarding mentoring, KCART 2024 standards related to mentorship, cultural competency, and MSJCC's codes and specific ones, and then biblical principles regarding mentorship, which should be very a fun idea. What does the Bible have to say about mentoring, bringing up the next generation of people who would believe? Generationally, in this case, not necessarily being based on age, but more based on the next generation of counselors, right? This says, please draw upon all you've considered with these questions to add gatekeeping and mentorship paragraphs, one of each, please. Crafting the newest draft of your teaching philosophy, incorporate feedback you received from me about the previous iterations, and submit those two sections along with everything else. Of course, you've deleted anything from the template that doesn't apply, that is like prompting stuff. Delete all that junk before you submit it, please. Here is that template for you. Looking at how it's going to be graded, your gatekeeping paragraph needs to present an expert, clearly articulated vision for gatekeeping that comprehensively integrates ethical principles, ACA ethical codes, KCART standards, cultural competency, and biblical or guiding existential principles. It needs to demonstrate deep insight, critical reflection, and a sophisticated understanding of how these components interact to support ethical and culturally responsive gatekeeping. And then mentorship is going to sound similar. So all the things that I asked you to prep and do can be embedded here, but synthesize all of it, please. That doesn't mean you don't cite specific codes, but you're sort of bringing together a lot of information into a single paragraph, and yours should look unique. Even though you're drawing upon the same ethics codes, the same small set of ethical principles, and obviously scripture is vast and there's a lot from which to draw there, but because you're thinking through these things, the same cultural MSJCCs, as you're thinking through these things, what emerges should be unique to you, even though you're drawing from some of the same sources. And then, of course, writing quality. Your writing in these two paragraphs, as always, should be clear, concise. More is not more. Clear, concise, easy to absorb, using present, not future, present progressive. So this is what I do, not this is what I will do. Tense throughout and having few errors. So that's how you'll be graded on that assignment. And then here is the other assignment for this week. Usually try to do 2 per week, so nothing on your course development package for this week, because we're looking at these processes, these activities that counselor educators engage in that are separate and apart from teaching students, and sometimes not, often, right, considered part of the salary of a full-time professor, but not explicitly necessarily judged or even rewarded. So a lot of the work that we do as counselor educators outside of a classroom setting is not necessarily honored or appreciated in the ways that I wish it was, like considered for promotion, for tenure, things like that. Nevertheless, it's our ethical responsibility to be engaging in these activities as we, again, bring up the next generation of counselors and as we protect the public from, by choosing to not expose them to counselors in training who are not ready to work with them and who could ultimately cause them harm. So this gatekeeping assignment here is an interesting one. I want to read through the assignment with you. After viewing the video, Gatekeeping at CCU, I showed that to you a minute ago, collaboratively evaluate CCU's gatekeeping approach using something called social annotation. Social annotation is like a collaborative discussion, but it's not so much trite like mini papers. Rather, you're taking something that already exists, in this case, the video explaining how we do gatekeeping at CCU. You're again bringing that critical lens, and you're looking at what CCU you believe does well, and what they could do better based on what the literature suggests are best practices. And so if you want to learn more about social annotation, which I encourage you to do, because social annotation, I argue in a book chapter that I wrote on online discussion, that social annotation is a better method than the standard discussion, threaded asynchronous discussion. I don't love those. I think they can quickly become stale and trite and sort of, thank you so much for, this and blah, blah. Like, it just doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel collaborative. And so something like social annotation, where everyone's putting their heads together and commenting on each other's comments, and everybody's viewing an actual thing critically, and it matters, right? I argue that that's a better method for classroom discussion. And so if you want to learn more about that so that you can use social annotation with your students when you are a counselor educator, then there's an excerpt here that from that book chapter that I wrote. Collaboratively annotate a document version of this Gatekeeping at CCU video. Begin your initial annotations by highlighting key ideas, inserting comments, images, tags, links, and GIFs, posing questions, and providing explanations, either in written or short video format. Next, view and respond to your classmates' annotations. Spark conversations, engage in debate, share knowledge, reply to comments, ask for clarification, provide alternative perspectives, and build upon your classmates' ideas. In other words, if you were all in the same room looking at the same video and then tearing it to pieces and pulling out what is great and commenting on that in a reinforcing way, pulling out what are shortcomings and commenting on that. Now, not necessarily my presentation style, right? Rather the process that we engage in at CCU. That's what I want you to critically analyze, not how I present. I mean, you're welcome to tear apart how I present, but that won't necessarily benefit as much as, looking at how does CCU do gatekeeping. And I can tell you this, we do not do everything as well as we could. And I say that as the chairperson of the Student Support Committee. However, having gone recently to the Southern Association for Counselor, Educator, and Supervisors Conference, I attended a lot of sessions on gatekeeping, and I found that CCU's process far outpaced the others. As a matter of fact, it was often the case that I got pretty frustrated and bored that the audience would ask very real questions. Well, what should we do about this? And they would staff these cases on the fly, right? I have the student who, blah, blah, blah. What in the world are we going to do about that? What should we do about that? And the presenters had no idea what should be done or how the best practices were. And so they would throw it back to the audience. Well, what do you guys think? What have you done that worked? And it kept being me that was saying, well, in my university, this is how we handle that. This is the process and procedures that we have in place, and this is how we support our fellow faculty members. This is how we support students. This is how we support site supervisors. This is what we do. This is how we assess in a formative manner throughout the program on the same skills and dispositions and behaviors, so that, gatekeeping is not a surprise. When students have a growth area, they're familiar with the sort of language around a certain disposition or behavior or skill. They've seen it multiple times. Multiple people have assessed them. They've self-assessed, right? So there's this thread of formative assessment, and everyone else in the room was like continually amazed, and that's interesting. So that was very interesting experience for me to see, because once you're immersed in a thing and you're building a thing and you've built the thing and you're running the thing, you just sort of accept the thing as it is. And to be pulled out of that experience and plunked down in a room full of counselor educators from all over, mostly the South, right, because it's the Southern Association, but and to hear them say, like, wow, y'all do that, that's a lot of infrastructure. But that doesn't mean that it's as good as it could be. And I look forward to reading the feedback that y'all are giving, because it could very well lead to further improvements in the process of gatekeeping at CCU, since I'm the one currently in charge of that. If I get to read your feedback and your thoughts and your ideas, then it may very well lead to improvement. But please try to be, rather than simply tearing down a thing, suggesting changes, right? You guys have all experienced this, where there's, I don't know if you want to call the person Debbie Downer, Negative Nancy, whatever. I have friends named Debbie and Nancy, so those are interesting terms for me. But like, there are people who can spot the problem, the shortcoming, a mile away, and they sure will shout out about it. But they don't come with ideas for improvement. They simply are the tear downers. They aren't also the build uppers. So please try, as you're engaging thoughtfully with CCU's current method, to offer links, ideas, thoughts, build on each other's ideas. How can this be as feasible and functional as possible, knowing that professors have to wear lots of hats and that we spend lots of time in these different activities. And again, gatekeeping and mentorship are things that are expected of the full-time professors at CCU, but not always considered when rewards come around, like promotion and things like that. CCU doesn't do tenure, but they definitely do promotions. And those aren't really things that are evaluated, but they can suck up a lot of professors' time. So as you generate ideas collaboratively and build on each other's ideas as a group, please know that that may have a very practical application, and I'm the one who could actually enact that. So I'm very curious and very grateful, but try to think through what would be the most functional, feasible way to do this that would take as little time and effort as possible. Because some pie in the sky thinking, well, you're sure that would be great, it's just not something that could actually be practically implemented. Yeah, don't just share your opinion, cite, reference scholarly literature. I mean, you can totally use your textbook. There's a whole chapter, and there's, they're citing different articles. But please feel free, and I encourage you and ask of you, if you have the bandwidth, move beyond that to even more recent peer-reviewed published articles on these topics. And then at the end of the session, what you're going to do is you're going to complete the self-annotation, social annotation self-checklist, where you're basically grading yourself. You're documenting your level of engagement with this collaborative assignment. So that's really important, that you honestly document how involved in this you are. And if you didn't put a lot into this collaborative assignment, go ahead, please, and be transparent and honest about that, and accept the consequences for your choices of that. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, when we look at a final grade, this may not be that big of a piece, but even if it was, your integrity, your character is reflected in assignments like these. If there is a large discrepancy between what you report you did and what you actually did, it's not a good reflection on your character. It doesn't reflect well on your character. So anyways, that, I think, is about it, except, of course, you're going to be contributing to your self-reflective journal in whatever method you've chosen, jotting stuff down on napkins, vlogging, whatever you want, right? I'm just flat out journaling. But here are the prompts for this week. This session focused on two primary tasks of the counselor educator, gatekeeping and mentoring. When you think of gatekeeping, what thoughts, feelings, questions, and concerns arise for you? And I assure you, gatekeeping can be dangerous work, and I'm not kidding, because students can passionately resent gatekeeping efforts, and then they can lash out. Some students have posted inaccurate, unbalanced, negative course and professor evals, and those evals are taken into account when the professor is up for promotion. So if a student who is angry that they were supported in a growth area, that a growth area was identified and they were supported, and it was a professor who first identified that growth area and tried to address it, some students, rather than receiving that with a grateful heart of, thank you, you clearly want me to become the best counselor I can be, instead they're like, I just want to fly under the radar, and now you've called me out, and now I have to do extra growth in this area. And so they retaliate. And their evals, the narrative, yes, but especially the numeric eval piece, has real consequences for counselor educators, can actually impact the counselor educator's income. I don't know if you've ever thought of that, but the scores on those evals are one of the easiest pieces for people who are evaluating a professor, considering them for promotion. A number is easier to look at than to read through a lot of narrative. And so the numbers that you give professors in your course evals and your professor evals can directly impact how much money they take home for themselves and their families. So it's very interesting because we have this ethical obligation to do it, to support students and to protect the public. But we also can be very penalized for it. So, I've had students that bullied professors by threatening to sue the university or by bypassing the professor altogether. Rather than coming to the professor and expressing their concerns, they just went to like the department chair, the dean, or even the president of the university and filed complaints with administrative leaders. Some students also just sort of tried to drum up peer support and sort of create a mutiny where all the students turn against the professor. I've heard stories from colleagues about that happening. And yet still gatekeeping remains our ethical obligation as counselor educators. So what did you learn from the social annotation assignment with regard to how CCU does gatekeeping? What will you take with you into your own future work as a counselor educator and as a supervisor with regard to your professional role as a gatekeeper? And then when you think of mentoring, what thoughts, feelings, questions, concerns arise for you? What has it been like for you so far as a mentee or as a mentor in other settings? Sometimes the most instructive and motivating experiences show us what we absolutely do not want to copy. We say, well, that was awful. I don't know exactly what I do want to be like as a mentor, but I sure don't want to be like that person who called themselves a mentor, but instead, maybe caused harm or just sort of was not on the scene, was like ghosted me. Let's see. Mentorship done well can be a challenge for counselor educators because students can be hungry for good mentorship. One of the dangers to mentoring well is that a large portion of your time and energy as a counselor educator can be spent before and after class, during office hours, and beyond mentoring students. I've had students in crisis, and it sort of hijacked my whole day. And it was an honor and a privilege to support them, but it meant that other things had to be sacrificed. I didn't get grading done on time, which then can impact my ability to be promoted because it impacts my late grading percentage, right? So knowing that mentorship is something that is self-rewarding a lot and that students who are mentored well are often very grateful. They often take time to express their gratitude, which is wonderful. But the powers that be that are decision makers in how that's rewarded from a financial perspective and a title and financial perspective may be completely ignorant of what mentorship you as a counselor educator have done and how much time and energy you have sacrificed for that endeavor. Let's see. What is your response to that? What is your plan for setting and maintaining healthy boundaries around mentorship? In other words, how do we give and stay well? As people, counselors, supervisors, counselor educators, leaders, advocates, researchers even, we tend to be people who give a lot. It's in our nature to give, but we need to stay well. And so we need to boundary our giving to stay healthy long term so that we don't burn out and exit the field, right? All right, so that's what's going on for this week. Thank you so much. I look forward especially to your ideas on how to improve CCU's system. Since I can enact really great ideas, I can enact them. And that can actually change the culture that CCU has around gatekeeping and its processes and procedures moving forward. You have that power. And so I hope that you act on it. Thanks.